If you could move anywhere in the world, where would it be? And how would you decide? Would you carefully research cost of living, healthcare, and visa requirements? Or would you do what I did and just sort of wing it? Hi, I'm Basha, and I spent 20 years living all over the world. And for most of that time, my approach to choosing my next home was, well, let's just say unscientific at best. I usually took the path of least resistance and prioritized things like how easy it was to get there with my 3 cats, for example. Or, my personal favorite, taking a teaching gig I found in a caretaker's newsletter of all places. But somehow it all worked out. Well, mostly. There was that one moment of panic when I was just getting settled into life in Prague and found out, with only 2 weeks' notice, that the country was about to join the dreaded Schengen zone. Suddenly, my little plan to just hop over the border every few months wasn't going to cut it, and if I didn't find a job fast so I could get a work visa, I was going to have to uproot myself yet again. So, that was how I did things back then. But now things are a little different. For one thing, I'm older, and so is my partner, and he's less adventurous than I am. So this time, since he's going with me, we need to actually plan ahead. In this video, I'll share what I've learned from 2 decades of spontaneous moves, and how I plan to do things very differently next time. So if you're thinking about moving abroad, let's talk about how to find the right place, on purpose, without leaving it all to chance. Today, I'll give you a big picture look at what really matters when choosing a country. And then in future videos, I'll dive deeper into the details. But before we get into the strategy, let me share a few stories from my past non-strategies for choosing a country. Or if you just want to get down to business, feel free to skip ahead to the chapter on strategy. Now let's get started. When I decided to move overseas, I set my sights firmly on Prague, which is a beautiful city in Eastern Europe. So I put my house up for sale, and I signed up for a course to get certified as a teacher of English as a foreign language, and I started planning how I was going to manage to move over there with my 3 cats. But 2 days before my house was going to go on the market, somebody decided to fly a couple of planes into the World Trade Center, and suddenly things got a little more complicated. First of all, it took me 5 months to sell my house instead of the 2 weeks I was counting on. And then, traveling by plane with 3 cats is a stressful proposition at best. And suddenly, with lines at airport security being 4 hours or more, I just didn't know how I was going to do it. And I started joking around with my friends and saying maybe I should just put the cats in the car and move down to Mexico. And it really was a joke at that time, but I noticed that every time I said it, I just felt this sense of relief. And so that's what I did. I put the cats in a car and I moved to Mexico. And I stayed there for about 3.5 years until my cats all passed on, and then I set my sights on my next destination. Toward the end of my stay in Mexico, I had gone on a trip to Thailand, sort of like a Buddhist pilgrimage, and the monk who led the pilgrimage had been my meditation teacher back in Denver, and he invited me to do some volunteer work in his little village, and so I decided to go there and teach English to the kids, which I did for about 3 months. And I know that probably doesn't seem like it qualifies as living somewhere, but believe me, when you spend 3 months in a village of probably less than 1,000 people, you've lived there, just about everybody in town, and it was an experience. So, but I still wanted to go to Europe, so that's why I cut things kind of short in Thailand. And I started out by designing this sort of nomadic lifestyle where I was going to go from one volunteer opportunity to the next. And I started out with an organization called WOOF, Willing Workers on Organic Farms. Unfortunately, my first 2 experiences volunteering in that way were not exactly positive. So I decided to kind of ditch that idea and convert my life from nomadic to slowmatic, meaning I'd stay in a place for a longer period of time. So I just happened to have subscribed to this newsletter called the Caretaker's Gazette, and they advertise for just what it sounds like, caretakers or house sitters, people to take care of properties while the owners are away. And weirdly, there was an ad there for a teaching position, teaching English in Poland. It was really a sweet deal. I had to teach English to a group of kids for, I think it was like 3 hours on a Saturday in exchange for room and board with this family. So I jumped on the opportunity because Poland was someplace that I had always kind of been curious to see anyway. So I did that for about 6 months, and I stayed in Poland for a while after that because I had a lot of friends there and I was enjoying my time. But I started thinking, what really is the point of my life? What am I doing with myself? I'm just hanging out, basically. So I wanted a little bit more purpose. So then I remember my original plans to go to Prague and get certified as a teacher of English as a foreign language. And I thought, I don't know if I really want to teach or not, but I might as well go through that course. It sounds like fun. So I went to Prague and did the course. I started interviewing for jobs, but I wasn't really that excited about getting back to working for a living. I was still living off my savings from selling my house. But as I said, the country was going to be joining the Schengen zone, and so the rules about immigration were changing really fast, and I had to get a job. So I stayed there, and I taught English for about a year, but I didn't really like being back in the corporate world. I was teaching not in a school, but in office buildings, so I would have a class in this corporate office, and then I'd have to jump on a tram and go all the way across town to some other corporate office. And being back in that corporate setting was just the antithesis of how I envisioned my life. I had to dress a certain way, I had to act a certain way. It just wasn't me. So in the meantime, I had taken a trip during the summer to Turkey, and I really fell in love with that country. The people were so kind and so hospitable. And I thought to myself, you know what? I need to move to that country and learn how to be more like these people. And so I did. I had met a woman there through the hospitality club, which is kind of like couch surfing, if you know what that is, where when you're traveling to a country, you can find a host and they might put you up in their home, or they might just show you around. It's a great way to get to know people when you're traveling. And I had stayed with her when I was visiting, and she just happened to have a room available in her flat. So I lived with her and another girl for a while. I stayed in Turkey for like 1.5 years altogether. And I don't know that I became as kind as Turkish people are, but it was a great experience. So unfortunately for me, but fortunately for her, my flatmate was getting married and moving to Istanbul, so I was going to have to find a new living situation anyway. And although I didn't really feel like I was done with Turkey yet, I had my eyes on this eco-village in Portugal. I wanted to try living there for at least 1 year, and they were willing to have me, but long story short, I couldn't get my visa. So I decided on plan B, which was to go and stay for a while with this guy I had met on Facebook in the UK, which is weird because I don't usually use Facebook to meet people. I use it to keep in touch with friends that I already know, but I ended up marrying the guy. But I stayed there for 5 or 6 years and lived in England for 5 of those years. And then we both moved to Scotland together, and that move was basically so that we could just cut our cost of living. And I stayed in Scotland for about 1 year before I left my husband, and at that point I decided to head back to the continent again. I really missed traveling around Europe. And when I left the UK, I had £800 in my bank account. That was it. And no plans beyond a 5-day camping trip in Switzerland. But I really lucked out because while I was at the crazy camp, I met this woman from Valencia who just happened to be planning another trip for shortly after the camp. And she invited me to cat sit for her while she was gone. So I went with her back to Valencia and sat with her cat for a couple of weeks. And then Providence just seemed to take over. While I was cat sitting in Valencia, I got an email from a friend of a friend who needed a cat sitter in Noord Haarlem in the Netherlands, and I love the Netherlands, so I jumped on that chance. And then while I was there, I got another email from a friend of a different friend who needed a cat sitter in Frankfurt. So I did that. And then I thought, my luck is going to run out sooner or later. I mean, when I left the UK, even though I had next to no money, I just felt like there had been this giant hand reaching out and supporting me every step along the way, and then placing these stepping stones in front of me. But I didn't think I could expect it to last forever. So I found this website called nomador.com. It's a pet sitting website. And through that, I found my next cat sitting opportunity in Eindhoven in the Netherlands. I took care of this magnificent Abyssinian cat there. He was really great. And while I was pet sitting there, I happened to meet a few people, and they knew what I was doing there. So one of them asked me if I was available right after my pet sit ended to take care of her 2 dogs. So I did that. And another translator that I knew in the same city then wanted a cat sitter for right after that. So, I mean, you couldn't ask for better luck than that. And so I continued with that pet sitting site, but I changed it up a little bit with Workaways, which is another volunteer site where I had much better luck than I did with Woof. And I don't mean to imply that Woof is necessarily going to give you bad experiences, but my first 2 were bad enough that I just never tried again. But my experiences with Workaways were, for the most part, pretty positive. I would say 2/3 of the experiences were really good, but 1/3 of them were not. So after doing that for a few years, I was kind of ready to slow things down again. And it's kind of stressful to always be on the road, 10 days here, 2 weeks there, a month here, 2 months there. At the same time, a really good friend of mine who'd been living in Mexico for about 9 years was moving back to Spain, to Barcelona, which is one of my favorite cities in Europe anyway. And I knew that Barcelona had a really great theatrical improv community, which was something that I had been pursuing since that camp in Switzerland. So with all those factors, plus the kind of negative experiences I'd been having with my last few Workaways, I decided to kind of settle down for a longer term in Barcelona. I had no idea how long I was going to stay there. But as I mentioned in my first video, while I was there, the pandemic hit, and I was kind of there by default for a long time, and only decided to leave when the income tax situation as a self-employed individual got to be really too much for me to handle. And so I came back to the US because other options in Europe weren't feeling really feasible at the moment because of the war in the Ukraine and how that was impacting the cost of fuel, for example, in Northern Europe. And so I just came back to the US to live with my partner, who is now going to be looking for the next destination with me. So as I mentioned, we're going to be a little more proactive about things this time. Although it didn't really start out that way, because when I first started dreaming about living in the States, almost as soon as I got here, my first thought was to run down to Argentina because I had to go down there for a surgery shortly after I moved here, and I just fell in love with the country. The people were so friendly. It's a big country with lots of different climates and geographies. Most importantly, they have the best carrot cake in the world. Check this out. I had it every day. And I wanted to go back there and have some more carrot cake. We were also considering other places in South America because Argentina, although it was really, really affordable, their economic instability made it a little unpredictable, and it was really hard to change money there. You couldn't really keep a lot of Argentine pesos on hand because they lost their value like really, really quickly. I mean, in the 5 weeks that I was there, the exchange rate went from 500 pesos to the dollar to over 800 pesos to the dollar, just to give you an idea. That worked in my favor, of course, but it would have made life a little complicated long term. But since my trip to Argentina, they've elected a new president, and suddenly the economic situation there really got out of control. And even expats now are complaining that they almost can't afford to live there anymore. So that doesn't look like a viable option anymore. So then we started looking into other South American countries, and those are still on the table. Mexico is off the boards completely, because even though it was, I thought, really, really safe when I lived there, at least the area that I lived in, it's not so safe anymore. I understand it's actually pretty risky, and it's just not someplace that I want to go. Talk about more about that in another video. And Portugal, I'm kind of leery about trying that. It's still on the boards, but because I've already had the experience of having my visa denied in Portugal, so all these considerations gave us some ideas about how plans can go awry, and because we're hoping that our next stop is going to be our last stop, we need to do some research. So, what do you need to take into consideration before you move overseas? Turns out quite a bit, and I'll be doing separate videos on most of these points in the future, but for now let's just do an overview. Now, before you get your heart set on a particular destination, first of all, you have to find out whether you're even allowed to live in that country. So you've got to look into the types of visas that are available and the eligibility criteria for all of them. And then, of course, you have to look into the application processes and whether or not that country has a path to permanent residency or citizenship. Why are these things important? Well, you may or may not be interested in changing your citizenship or picking up an extra passport, but getting permanent residency becomes really important, especially if you're planning to retire someplace, because you want to hedge against things like, for example, a rise in the financial requirements for maintaining your residency there. And I just watched a video on YouTube about this couple living in Turkey, and suddenly, because they're having a lot of inflation apparently in Turkey now, the requirements went up to something like 800 euros per month to be able to maintain your residence there, and one half of this married couple doesn't have that much, and it's apparently just per person. You know, they don't count the total household income. And he's from the United States and she's from Holland. She doesn't have enough to qualify for living in the United States. He doesn't have enough to qualify for living in Holland. And so they're finding themselves late in life where he's in poor health and not really able to travel very well, needing to find another place to live. You want to make sure you don't get in that situation. Now, there are a lot of expat websites that are pretty helpful with information on what it's like to live in different countries and what the requirements are, but you need to take those with a grain of salt because they are crowdsourced for the most part, and they may or may not be up to date. And of course, if you look at different countries on different websites, you're going to find different information. So I would say that they're good to get a general idea, but your best source of up-to-date and accurate information is going to be the consular websites for the country that you're looking at. And all you have to do is Google, for example, if you live in the United States and you're looking at, Thailand. So all you have to do is Google Thailand consulate in the United States, and you'll get the local consulate that should have visa information for you to look at. They're not always the easiest to understand, but between the expat sites and the consular websites, you should get a pretty good idea. So the next thing you need to look at is, of course, the cost of living. For us, that's going to be a major concern because we're going to have to survive on Social Security. So you need to find out what things cost and see if that's aligned with your budget. And the components of that, of course, are going to be housing, utilities, groceries, transportation, health insurance, your entertainment costs, the costs of immigration and visa renewal. And then you need to start looking into things like minimum bank deposits, for example. Banks are operated differently in different countries. And for example, when I lived in Spain and opened a bank account there, which I needed to do, I had to have a minimum flow of, I think, 1,000 euros a month going into that bank account if I wanted to avoid really heavy fees. So those are all important things to look into. So as I mentioned, there are websites out there that will give you a good idea of what it's like to live in a given country, and there are websites that will compare the cost of living with one country versus the cost of living in another. There's another one called Global Passport. I've got the link down there. And that one gives you a free citizenship eligibility test, so that could come in kind of handy. So once you've got a handle on the cost of living, you may have narrowed things down a little bit. And the next thing you need to take a look at are your tax obligations, both from the country you're moving from and the country you want to move to. In the United States, I know we have a lot of double taxation agreements or treaties with other countries so that your earned income up to, I think it's the threshold now is up to $130,000. So your first $130,000 of income in another country are not taxable in the United States, but you still have to file a tax return. And of course, any of your unearned income is taxable in the United States, and you may have to pay taxes in both countries there. Basically, you are obligated to pay taxes on your income in the country that you live in at the time. The United States is one of the countries that taxes people on their worldwide income, and the only exemption that I know of is that first $130,000 worth of earned income, but only earned income. So if you have income from rentals, dividends and that sort of thing, bonds, you're going to have to pay taxes on those in the United States if you're from here. And then you need to look into whether or not, if you're planning on surviving on Social Security, you need to look into whether or not your Social Security is going to be taxed in that country and how much. And once you've got all the financial factors under control, then another important thing to look into, especially if you are an older person, is the healthcare system. You're going to want to assess the quality of healthcare, its accessibility and affordability. Do you need to get private health insurance? And if so, what's covered? Now, most countries, I believe, when you first move there, you do need to get private health insurance. But let me tell you, it's a lot cheaper in most countries than it is in the United States. When I was living in Spain, my first year there, I had to get private health insurance, and the requirement was that it had to cover absolutely everything that was covered under the state health insurance. And I got all that, 100% coverage with no copay and no deductible for about 100 euros a month, and it went up slightly every year as I aged, but not very much. I think at the end I was paying 132 or something per month, compared to when I came to the United States and started looking into private health insurance. And the best I could get without the Affordable Care Act, which I had to wait for an enrollment period to sign up for, the cheapest one I could find, which didn't cover much and had huge deductibles and copays, was over $1,000 a month. Another consideration, of course, is climate and the environment. You're going to want to take a look at weather patterns, for example, high and low average temperatures, average annual rainfall. What are some other weather things? Humidity. If those things are important to you, you want to know before you get there. And what are the risks of natural disasters? Is the place prone to hurricanes, earthquakes, tsunamis? You probably want to know about that before you go. And then you want to consider other environmental factors that may affect your lifestyle, like pollution, noise. Noise was a big one for me. You want to look at the lifestyle that people live. Are people out partying late at night in the streets? Is that going to affect your sleep? And aesthetics. If you have a sense of aesthetics and that's important to you, and there are electric wires hanging out in the street and telephone wires and things, is that going to be a big turnoff for you? So all of those things, you have to kind of make up a list for yourself, what's important to me, and then check those things out. Another big consideration, of course, is going to be safety and security. So you're going to want to look at crime rates, and the type of crime is important too. Like, some people might consider Barcelona to be a high crime area because it is literally the pickpocket capital of the universe. But it's mostly pickpocketing that you run into there, and violent crime, although it's on the upswing a little bit, was not really a major concern. Just a few years ago when I lived there, I was perfectly comfortable walking clear across town even late at night. So those are some things to take into consideration, because other countries do have a lot more violent crime. They may have robberies and break-ins, so you want to look into protecting yourself and protecting your assets. Political stability is another factor that may affect your safety. If there's a revolution, when you're living there, that's not going to be a very comfortable situation. So checking into the history of the country a little bit and what the political climate is like might be a good idea. And then there's overall safety, especially for women, and especially if you're living alone. You want to ensure a secure living environment for yourself. So look at the incidence of street crimes and sexual assaults and that kind of thing, kidnappings. It sounds pretty dire, and most countries you go to that's not going to be a concern, but you definitely want to look into it. You also want to look into how economic disparity might affect your relationship with local people. I mean, I think one of the greatest things about moving to another country is getting to know the people who live there, and learning about another culture. And just because you have, relatively speaking, more money than some of the people who live there doesn't mean that it's going to negatively impact your experiences. So you need to kind of feel things out. Are people going to be hitting you up for loans or gifts all the time? And if so, are you okay with that? Or is it going to become a nuisance and you'd rather not deal with it? Is it going to make you a target for theft and burglary? Because in some countries, even poor people get robbed, their houses get broken into. And in other countries, wealthier people are the target. So do you have a way to deal with that? Or do you just not want to deal with it all and choose another country? And those are kind of harder things to find out without, having the experience of living there or talking to other people who do live there. Of course, you do want to travel to a country before you decide to live there, which is not something that I always did, but it's a good idea. You definitely get more of a feel for what it's going to be like. And as far as actual danger, a good source of information is the State Department's travel advisory. They'll keep you up to date on things like terrorism and violent crime and things like that. And I have to say the State Department does go a little overboard in erring on the side of caution, but better safe than sorry, right? And if you are so inclined, you can also register with the State Department's STEP program, which offers assistance and notification during crises like, political revolutions and natural disasters. Another consideration is the economic stability of the country that you're looking at. As I mentioned before, Argentina went practically overnight after the elections from a very affordable place to a very unaffordable place. Where in the past their economic instability kind of worked in our favor, not in their favor, but as expats or travelers, it was a really cheap country to go to. And that's not true anymore. And it's not always possible to predict that, but if you see an election coming up and it looks like there's somebody who wants to stir the pot a little bit, that might be something to pay attention to. And then you want to look at the economic health of the country altogether. A lot of expat websites are telling you what the GDP of the country is, and I'm not really sure how that affects me or how it affects you. I would more look at things like inflation rates, the cost of living, whether those things have gone up a lot in recent years, how they were affected by the pandemic, for example. You also want to check the stability of the currency against the stability of your currency. Have those exchange rates over time had a steady trend, either upward or downward, or have they maintained a more normal fluctuation over time? And that way you can kind of predict, how your future costs are going to be impacted. Another big consideration, which I'm pretty comfortable with usually, but my partner isn't, is language and communication. You're going to need to know what is the primary language that's spoken in the country you want to go to, and do you know that language? Do you feel capable of learning that language, or do you feel comfortable just getting by with sign language and a smile? If you happen to come from the United States, UK, or other English-speaking country, you're in luck because English has sort of become the de facto international language due to a variety of factors, including how easy it is to learn and the fact that a lot of tech programming languages in English, and it's used in business and everything. So check out the prevalence of English in the country that you're looking at. You might be surprised at how many people speak English. On the other hand, maybe nobody does, especially in the smaller villages. So you have to use that information to gauge the potential for language barriers and your ability to overcome them. Next on the list is cultural and social integration. Are the people in the country that you're looking at open to outsiders? Are you open to exploring local customs and traditions? What about the presence of expat communities to facilitate social integration? And what's the pace of life like there? Is it compatible with the way that you want to live? For example, what about timing of things like meals? One thing that was a really big change for me in Spain was that if I ate lunch at all, it was probably around noon or so, and then I ate dinner maybe 6, 7 o'clock at night. And in Spain, they don't even eat lunch until like maybe 3 in the afternoon, and dinner, like they don't even start serving dinner until 8 p.m. in most restaurants, but most people are eating at like 10 p.m. So if you eat in restaurants a lot, that's something to take into consideration, because restaurants tend not to be open or serving meals when it's not mealtime. Of course, housing and accommodation is another big consideration. Starting with, where are you going to live when you first arrive? Are you going to go there ahead of time and set up a place to rent? That's what I did when I moved to Mexico. I took a recon trip there and rented a place. So I had a place to arrive to with my 3 cats. Or are you going to be more spontaneous and just maybe stay at an Airbnb for the first month while you're looking for a place? But before you go, either way, you do need to investigate housing options, how much it costs to rent or buy. And if you want to buy, are you even allowed to own property in that country? Because a lot of countries don't allow that. Then you want to look into the rental markets and check out their fees, for example. In a lot of countries, Czech Republic springs to mind, if you wanted to rent through an agent rather than going directly to the landlord, you had to pay a fee to that agent equal to 1 month's rent, which came as a big shock to a lot of American expats that were living there. So you want to be prepared for that. And those things are not negotiable. That's just the way business is done there. So you want to have all that kind of information up front. You may have to put a realtor's fee plus a deposit plus the first month's rent, maybe more. So if you don't have a big budget to work with, those are some things to know before you even move to the country. And then you're going to want to check out the availability of amenities like heating, electricity, and the internet, if that's important to you. Another thing you might want to consider that most people probably wouldn't think of is how cities are structured. For example, if you live in the United States, we're used to thinking of the downtown area as the place where we go to work, and then we go to live either in the suburbs or in another neighborhood in the city, more in the outlying areas. And those inner areas of the city they tend to be more high crime and more densely populated, and not typically really desirable areas to live unless you're in a Fifth Avenue penthouse or something in New York. But what you need to know is that things are just the opposite in a lot of places. For example, in most European cities, downtown is the place to be. It's the safest area. It's where people congregate. People are in the streets all the time. Life is lived outside. You're always out at cafes and restaurants, and walking on the streets, even till late at night in a lot of places, is really quite safe. And those outer areas, I don't even know if you could call them suburbs. They're more industrial in Europe, those outer areas. They're really undesirable places to live. So you need to keep that in mind when you're looking at where in a city to live. And those expat websites are going to come in really, really handy for that kind of stuff. And another consideration that might not be considered, I certainly didn't consider it before I moved to Barcelona, was how the architectural style is going to affect your lifestyle. Barcelona has the weirdest architecture in the world. They're the blocks of flats are kind of built like donuts. So on the outside you have your living spaces, and on the inside are these air holes basically, or light shafts, where you have interior rooms that never see the light of day. You open up your window and get a little bit of fresh air coming in. But the only problem with that, other than never getting any direct sunlight, is that everybody else in the building is doing the same thing. So you hear everything. You hear people flushing their toilets in the middle of the night. You hear people arguing. You smell everything they're cooking. You smell everything else. And there's basically no privacy. And And safety was not an issue with that particular thing, but you want to look at the architectural style and see how that's going to affect your safety. Is it okay to live on the ground floor? If you do live on the ground floor, do you need bars on the windows? That's pretty common in a lot of Latin American countries. And do you feel comfortable living in that kind of an environment? All things to take into account. If you're planning to move overseas and you're not retiring and you're not independently wealthy, then you're going to want to look into employment and income opportunities. First and foremost, are you allowed to work in the country that you want to go to? And what are the requirements to get a work permit? You're going to want to identify job markets and maybe opportunities for remote work or entrepreneurship as well. And there actually are some countries where they'll actually pay you to start a business in their country. And you can find a lot of YouTube videos on that sort of thing. So that might be something worth looking into. If you're moving with children, then there are a whole slew of other considerations that you have to look at. First of all, you're going to need to look at education and childcare. You're going to want to consider the quality and availability of schools and determine whether you want to go with public or private schools. And if your kids are very young, then you're going to want to look at childcare facilities. Are there daycare centers? Do you want to hire a nanny or an au pair? A lot of different options. And how comfortable do you feel with any of those options? Then you want to look at educational support services. Can you get a tutor that will help? Because if your kids don't already speak the native language of that country, they're going to struggle at first, I imagine. So do you want to look into an American school? Yes, there is such a thing. In fact, my flatmate in Spain, she was Spanish, Catalonian, but she went to an American school when she was a kid, and they did all the classes in English. That would certainly help kids get integrated, I would think, if they could not have to speak a foreign language during their very first year in another country. And then moving on, are you bringing a pet with you? If so, the first thing you're going to need to know is whether or not you're allowed to bring an animal to the country. And if you are, what do you need to get your pet in? Do you need a vaccine certificate, for example, or a statement from a vet about your pet's health? Does the country you're moving to have a quarantine? Now, the UK, before they built the channel, they had a 6-month quarantine for bringing a pet into the country. 6 months. The quarantine was not in your home, it was at a facility. So basically, your dog or cat or whatever you had was going to have to live in a little cage for 6 months without you. Needless to say, that's not a very pleasant option for somebody who's basically a member of your family. I know, Wally, we won't do that to you. We won't really. In fact, we're holding off our move overseas while Wally is with us because we just don't want to put him through all that. And that might be something you want to think about. The stress of transporting a pet to another country and the stress of quarantines. I already shared with you that I moved to Mexico with my 3 cats, and I did it by car. But in retrospect, I would not do that again, and for a lot of reasons that I'll go into in another video. But just to keep it short, those are some of the things you're going to have to look into if you have your heart set on going and you want to bring your pet with you. So you've done your research, you've picked out your country, and you're ready to go. Next thing is packing and moving. Are you going to bring your things with you, or are you going to do a purge and get rid of everything? What are the costs of bringing your stuff with you? Of course, that depends a lot on where you are and where you're going to. But if you're actually moving overseas, as in overseas, is your stuff really worth the cost of transporting it? I just think you can have a lot of fun shopping for new furniture and even new clothes in a new place. Just kind of reinvent yourself, why not? And then once you get there, another thing that's going to be important to you is transportation. What are the public transportation systems like? Do they have metros, which are kind of the European word for subways? Do they have trains, buses? Do you need a car to get where you want to go? What are road conditions like? And if you are going to drive a car, what side of the road do they drive on? You know, the UK is not the only place where they drive on the left side of the road. You might be surprised that they do it in Thailand too, and probably some other countries. So if you have to learn to drive on the other side of the road, can you do it without getting confused and getting into a head-on collision, which Those happen sometimes. And what would be the cost of buying and maintaining a car? Does that fit into your budget? And then if you don't speak the local language, are you going to be able to read the road signs? Are you going to be able to pass the driver's test to get your license and maintain a license in that country? Those are all considerations, but the good news is that most countries outside of the United States have a pretty darn good public transportation system. And then if you're going to be traveling a lot while you're living in the country, you want to consider proximity to airports and train and bus stations so that you don't have to spend half your time just getting to the station. Another thing that'll affect your daily life is access to goods and services. You may be used to certain brand names and luxury items that you very well may not be able to get in another country. But there may be some things you can get there that you can't get here too. So what you have to decide is what you can and cannot live without. What do you consider to be essential goods, and are they available in the country you're going to? We have a friend who lives in Costa Rica, and he can't get peanut butter there. Now, I can live without peanut butter, but apparently it's a big deal to him, so he stocks up when he comes back to visit here. We're not planning to be running back and forth to the United States wherever we go, so we're going to have to find a place that has everything that we consider to be necessary. So you might want to consider specialty items and things like medications and supplements. And then what about services to maintain your lifestyle? Do you need to hire somebody to clean your home or mow your lawn if you have one, or do your gardening? Those are all things to keep in mind. And then, how much is all of that going to cost you? Another thing that maybe isn't so much fun to talk about, but it is necessary, is the legal and regulatory environment. You're going to have at least a basic understanding of the local laws and regulations. For example, did you know that in Singapore, spitting on the sidewalk is illegal and punishable with a fine of up to $1,000? And importing and selling chewing gum is also illegal. I mean, if you're traveling there, you can bring in enough for your own personal use. That's okay. But if you're going to bring it in and sell it, that's a big no-no. And here's one that really threw me for a loop. When I was living in Mexico, I had to send some legal documents to the United States, and I needed to have them notarized. And when you have something notarized in the United States, you go to a notary public, and they don't care what you're signing. They just witness your signature and make sure that you are who you say you are. You have to show them some ID, and that's about it, And they give you their little stamp, and off you go. Well, I went to a notary public in Mexico, and she said, "This is in English, I can't read it." I was like, "Well, you don't have to read it. I just need it notarized." And she wouldn't do it. She said, "No, I have to know what it says." So I actually had to go to a translator. She wouldn't take, my personal translation, even though I was fluent in both languages. It had to be a certified translation. So I had to pay for that. And then I had to go back to the notary public, and then she could read the document and notarize my signature. But that was totally unexpected. That, of course, isn't something that I necessarily would have had to know ahead of time, but those are just the kind of things that can really throw you for a loop. And you do want to know what your legal rights are there, and just the basic legal framework to ensure that you're always in compliance with the law so that you can protect your personal interests. So now we come back to financial services. Do you need a local bank account, or can you get by with the bank account that you already have in your country if they allow you to have a foreign address? Or do you want to look into a borderless account like the one that Wise offers? That's what I have, and I find it to be really great because I can have money in different currencies all in the same bank. They're in different accounts, and then I can use my debit card anywhere. And that's another thing you want to look into. Will your ATM card work in ATMs in the country that you're going to? Because it doesn't always happen. And if you're going to be using cash, or even if you're not, you do want to understand the currency exchange processes in the country that you're going to, and what are the best ways and places to exchange your money. Do you want to use a wire service like Western Union, which can give you the best rates, like they did when I was in Argentina. But even though my first 1 or 2 transfers were free of charge, after that they started charging me $8 for every transfer. So it's like, well, is that an expense that I want to keep incurring? And then bank fees, like I said, it's really different in other countries. You're probably, if you have a local bank account, you're going to be paying monthly fees. So you kind of have to weigh that against the cost of, currency exchange and wire fees. And then, of course, with all that in mind, you're just going to want to set up your monthly budget based on what the local costs actually are and what your priorities are and what you consider necessities and what you consider luxuries. Now, if you're going to retire overseas, then you have to consider how your Social Security and or other retirement benefits like pension or 401k are going to get to you in your new home country. At the present time, I believe that you can get your Social Security payment wired directly to your local bank account in the country where you live. I don't know if things are going to continue that way or not, but that's the way it is right now. As far as other benefits, you're going to have to consult directly with your financial institution to see whether they're okay with sending your funds overseas. If not, then you're going to need to set up a bank account where you're living right now that does that, or you're going to have to look into getting an international account like the Wise Borderless account. By the way, I don't get any money from Wise for saying that, but I've been using their Borderless account for since 2016, almost 10 years. So it's been really helpful for me, moving from country to country so much, and I highly recommend it. Plus, they give really, really good exchange rates. So after you've got the transfer of your living funds all set up, then you want to look into emergency services and support. Do they have something that's similar to 911? A lot of countries do have a number to call in case of emergencies, and it's usually a 3-digit number, but it's not always 911. For more earth-shattering types of disasters like hurricanes and earthquakes, you might want to consider enrolling in a program like the U.S. State Department's Smart Travel Enrollment Program, or STEP, where they offer assistance in crises like that and notify you if there's something coming up, like if there's terrorist activity, and they're advising citizens to get out of the country. So I know this is really a lot to consider, but don't let it overwhelm you. Just try to have fun with it and think of all these points as tools for helping you design your best possible future. And if you want a really, really detailed checklist for moving abroad, check out the Nomadic Fire link that I've put below, because they have a checklist that includes 90, 60, and 30-day tasks, and it is the most complete and detailed checklist I have ever seen. It might be overkill in some ways, but it covers the bases. And there are, to be fair, there really are a lot of things to consider when you're moving overseas. And because of that, we're going to be taking a unique approach to it this time around. The world is a different place today, sometimes for the better and sometimes for the worse, but we're going to take advantage of modern technology, and we're going to use AI to help us weed through all this information and narrow things down according to our own needs and priorities. And we're going to share that with you in future videos. Our next video is going to be about volunteering overseas as a lifestyle, so be sure to subscribe so you don't miss out. And please hit that like button so this video can get out there to as many people as possible, and we can start growing this community together. See you next time.